Regime is rarely tolerated. Bloggers and journalists regularly jailed for voicing criticism or discontent. That's what makes the violent protests of the past few days so extraordinary. Much will depend on how the military, loyal to Mubarak, chooses to act in the coming days. Arab governments across the Middle East are watching what happens here very closely. Whether or not the protests are ultimately suppressed or whether they build, fearful of the domino effect and the potential of people power to push undemocratic regimes from their pedestals. Margaret Evans, CBC News, Cairo.
Ya Mubarak, ya Mubarak, ya Mubarak, ya Mubarak.
The protests continue.
We will not go home until this regime is over.
We need a new government.
To try to quell the demonstrations, the Mubarak regime shut down the internet.
Freedom, freedom, freedom now!
But supporters of the protest in other countries, including Canada, helped get their message out on Facebook and Twitter.
They take this technology from our country.
What does that tell you?
Tell me that the government is afraid.
In Egypt, the clashes became more violent. Riot police attacked the protesters with water cannons, tear gas, and even stones. Mubarak's ruling party headquarters was looted and set on fire. The army rolled in, but the old president refused to resign.
I have requested the government to step down today, and I will designate a new government as of tomorrow.
When that didn't satisfy protesters and the crowds in Cairo's Tahrir Square continued to grow, Mubarak said he would step down when his term was over.
What I aim for now is to restore the stability of this country in order to ensure a peaceful transfer of power in a way that preserves the security of Egypt and the Egyptian people.
And when that didn't work either, his supporters attacked the people in the square. The CBC's Nala Ayed was there.
Eager to have their say, they started gathering early. Theirs was no cry for change, no demand for revolution. This was a spirited defense of the status quo. For more than a week, they'd watched as anti-regime protests got all the attention. And if this was going to be their day, they were going to be heard. All of us are at his disposal, he says. He feels with the people, and the people are tired and suffocated. In short order, the crowd mushroomed, fiercely insisting Mubarak would not leave. Then they began marching to Liberation Square and into certain confrontation. A nation divided, two different crowds, two competing messages, and a lot of resentment. Sure enough, it proved explosive. At first, it was a heavy volley of stones, each in a crude attempt to blunt the other's voice. Then it escalated into vicious hand-to-hand clashes. Some anti-Mubarak protesters were brutally beaten. Others were scattered by horses, camels, and whips. The pro-Mubarak side accused of coming in with hidden knives and sticks, spoiling for a fight. From the top of a building, pro-Mubarak protesters showered their adversaries with bricks and chairs. Then it escalated again. A nasty exchange of Molotov cocktails lobbed into both camps. Ambulances rushed in as the number of casualties soared. As night fell, the crowds thinned out. Still, at times, the violence flared. The much-feared Interior Ministry ordered people to leave. But they didn't. And closer to midnight, the anger boiled over again. Gunfire and more petrol bombs, starting several fires. This man caught some of the flames before putting them out. Occasionally, someone fell into the wrong hands and paid a heavy price. Images this nation will not soon forget. Both sides accuse the other of being manipulated, that the pro-Mubarak protesters were bussed in and ordered to rout the other side, that the anti-Mubarak protesters were driven and financed by foreign hands. At the root of it, though, it seems this battle is between freedom and stability, two wishes that aren't necessarily incompatible. Peter.
Nala, what was the military during all this?
Well, the Army did today what it has been doing since it came to the streets just a few days ago, which is to stand aside and observe, although there has been now a call from the military and the Interior Ministry asking everybody in downtown Cairo to leave.
But they didn't leave. The army didn't force them to move. And the pressure continued to grow as strikes and protests paralyzed the country. So when Mubarak announced he would address the nation on television, many expected he would step down, only to be bitterly disappointed.
Hosni Mubarak is going to leave, and he's going to leave very soon.
As he began to speak, they quieted down, trained their sights onto the makeshift screen, or tuned in via telephones. His first words were conciliatory. All your victims, those who were killed, their blood will not go in vain, he said. I pledge to punish those who were responsible for these losses. He went on, and they waited, but still no mention of an impending departure. On the contrary, he would stay. That is the oath I had made, and I will preserve it until we take Egypt to the shores of safety, he says. I have decided to transfer my powers to the vice president. Egypt will stand on its feet again. Even before he was finished, they gave him what they said was the only appropriate response. Then they erupted in anger. Leave, 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 they chanted. I felt disappointment. I felt lies, he says. A lie that's lasted 30 years.
And the next day, Mubarak finally gave up. After 30 years in power, he resigned and handed power over to the military.
President Hosni Mubarak has decided to step down as a president of the republic.
Now they could breathe. It was an Egyptian wedding, a birth, and a graduation party all at once. Mostly, though, it was a declaration of victory after a battle that lasted 30 long years. You are the ones who brought liberation, he says. We were overwhelmed by the overjoyed, desperate to tell us how they felt. She says, I'm going to sleep very well tonight because the dogs are gone. The years of oppression and anger vanished in a sea of song and laughter. Vanished as they finally tasted it.
Freedom! Freedom! Freedom!
The army? From the start of this crisis, the people believed their beloved army would not let them down. The soldiers were celebrated as Egypt's saviors from the lowest depths of destitution.
Freedom in Egypt! Freedom in Egypt!
They gained it by their own sheer will, a sudden determination to save themselves from whom they now call the last pharaoh. Tonight, a stone's throw from the ancient Nile, they said repeatedly, lift your head, you are Egyptian.
Egypt's military rulers have promised to hand over power to an elected civilian government in 6 months and are now drafting a new constitution. But even as peace returned to that country, revolts were breaking out in other places. There have been protests in Iran and Algeria. In Bahrain, tens of thousands of protesters poured into the streets to demand the resignation of that country's government, and there were some violent clashes. In Yemen, there were also violent clashes as students and other protesters battled supporters of the government. But the worst violence came in Libya, where the country's dictator Muammar Gaddafi used jet planes to attack protesters. Hundreds of people were killed. As for that young fruit seller who started it all by setting himself on fire, he is now a hero all over the Middle East and North Africa. And the mayor of Paris says he will name a street or a park after him. And that is News in Review. Don't forget to check out our website at newsinreview@cbclearning.ca. I'm Michael Serapio. Thanks for watching. She was a rising political star until tragedy struck.
She was shot through and through on one side of the head and went through her brain.
A shooting that triggered an angry political debate in the United States.
The anger, the hatred, the bigotry that goes on in this country is getting to be outrageous. That may be free speech, but it's not without consequences.
On News in Review today, the shooting of Gabrielle Giffords. Hello, I'm Michael Serapio. On the morning of January 8th, an American Congresswoman, Gabrielle Giffords, was meeting with some of her constituents in Tucson, Arizona. She had set up a table outside a busy supermarket, and people were lining up to ask her questions when suddenly a young gunman walked up to her and opened fire.
A guy came to the Safeway and started shooting. I saw him. He was in a beanie and a hooded sweatshirt and jeans.
Ma'am, we do have the help on the way. How many people are injured there?
We have about a total of 10 people, maybe more. Oh my God.
6 people were killed. More than a dozen others, including Giffords, were wounded.
I heard about 15 to 20 gunshots in the parking lot. I came outside immediately. Did not see a vehicle or any people fleeing. I just saw people running, screaming towards where the shooting happened. Everyone screaming that it was Gabrielle Giffords.
Giffords was rushed to hospital where doctors reported she had been shot in the head.
She was shot through and through on one side of the head and went through her brain.
When you say optimistic, are you optimistic for a full recovery? Is it too early to tell?
We cannot tell what kind of recovery, but I'm about as optimistic as it can get in this situation.
As for the gunman, he turned out to be 22-year-old Jared Lee Loughner. He was captured at the scene of the shooting and made a court appearance 2 days later. The CBC's David Common has that story.
Federal agents have yet to clear the crime scene, a supermarket parking lot where Giffords was holding a Saturday meet and greet. A lone gunman approached and opened fire, hitting 20 people.
And I saw him as he was shooting the Congresswoman.
Dr. Stephen Rales tackled the shooter.
He was putting up some resistance, but not thrashing about. You know, he did not say anything. He was just sort of he was on the ground and he was sort of staring out to the side, but not really reacting.
But today in court, 22-year-old Gerald Lee Loughner did speak, acknowledging the charges against him. His lawyer once defended the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. This is not one of those never-saw-it-coming stories, though. Loughner's videos on YouTube include ramblings on government mind control.
You know, like he was shaking and kind of seemed like he was under the influence of drugs.
He was recently kicked out of classes at this community college. His bizarre outburst prompted his instructor to fear Loughner would one day bring a gun to class.
Because he was saying these random comments, these outbursts, like, how can you deny math instead of accepting it? And that's like thrown for a loop there.
Police know Loughner bought the gun in November and believe the shooting was planned. Loughner went to the supermarket by cab, even entering the store with this man, the driver, to break a 20 to pay his fare. Loughner was recently turned away by the U.S. Army, the latest in a series of rejections in his life.
It's just very unfortunate that a wonderful, wonderful person happened to be the target, I think, of his frustrations.
The city, indeed the country, have been profoundly affected. Giffords was shot through the brain, but remarkably, is showing signs of awareness. Her husband, a NASA astronaut, is at her side and wants people to remember the 6 lives lost in Saturday's shooting. We must never forget them, and our prayers are with their families, said Mark Kelly, adding, when this tragedy occurred, Gabby was doing what she loved most, hearing from her constituents. As people continue to drop off flowers behind me, the police are building their case. It is believed they have video of the shooting. And if Loughner is found both sane and guilty, he could face the death penalty.
Once the shock began to wear off, the recriminations began. Giffords is a Democratic Party politician, and she had been heavily criticized by her Republican Party opponents. When she supported President Barack Obama's health care bill, her office was vandalized. And last year, the right-wing politician Sarah Palin posted a map on Facebook identifying vulnerable Democrats, including Giffords, with gun sight crosshairs. Here's how Giffords reacted to that.
We're on Sarah Palin's targeted list, but the thing is that the way that she has it depicted has the crosshairs of a gun sight over our district. And when people do that, they've got to realize there's consequences to that action.
Words that were echoed after the shooting by others.
The anger, the hatred, the bigotry that goes on in this country is getting to be outrageous. That may be free speech, but it's not without consequences.
The sheriff was referring to the violent rhetoric of some right-wing radio and television hosts, but they denied that their angry words had any connection to the shooting. Here's the CBC's Neil McDonald.
All sorts of commentators here have said the same thing, but Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh and the rest of the far right-wing talk radio and TV crowd were lashing back today at any suggestion they may have helped incite an attack on an elected Democrat.
We are not going to play defense at all. Offense. How dare the media? How dare politicians, left and right?
This from the man who once said,
"This president, I think, has exposed himself as a guy over and over and over again who has a deep-seated hatred for white people or the white culture."
From Rush Limbaugh.
At no time has anybody who does what I do or I ever called for violence.
This from a man who said the following.
There's going to be a gang rape. There is going to be a gang rape by a Democratic Party.
Or whose shock radio fellow traveler, Michael Savage, said this.
Obama is raping America. Obama is raping our values. Obama is raping our democracy.
That is the political environment in which Jared Lee Loughner's